Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. Now I'm going to put my hands up and admit that I had never heard of the Atlanta child murders before Mindhunter season 2 aired on Netflix. Even the biggest true crime researchers can't be expected to know every single case out there, and this one was my blind spot. But ever since I finished Mindhunter, I've been avidly researching this case and trying to learn as much as I can. Now this is technically a solved case. Somebody has been convicted of a couple of the murders I'm going to be talking about. But it's kind of a strange one because somebody's only been convicted of 2 out of 28 possible cases. The rest of them were kind of just closed and attributed to this one person. So this is one of those weird cases where it's a solved / not solved kind of video. The Atlanta child murders are sometimes referred to as just the Atlanta murders, a series of murders committed in Atlanta, Georgia between July 1979 and May 1981. At least 28 children and adults were killed and attributed to the same murderer. The majority of the victims were young black boys. Just earlier this year, Atlanta police reopened the case to test new evidence using new DNA technology to erase any lingering doubt over who killed the children. Before I get into the specifics of this case, I need to set the scene a little bit. You know, I always love to dive into a bit of sociological context, but it's particularly important in this case so you can understand the background, how this came to be. So this was happening in the late 70s / early 80s in Atlanta, Georgia, a city which had recently grown to be an economic powerhouse in the South. A number of huge companies set up shop there, providing employment opportunities for all. Since the Civil Rights Movement barely a decade earlier and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed segregation in schools, public places and jobs, there was an increasing black population in the city of Atlanta, and a young black lawyer named Maynard Jackson was actually voted into the mayor's office, and this was a huge deal at the time. But of course racism didn't just vanish overnight now they had a black mayor and there were more black people in the city. Even in one of the more progressive cities in the South, civil rights didn't give black Americans the same opportunities and prospects as white people. Prospects were better, sure, since the Civil Rights Act, and they were on the rise, but we're talking about late 70s, early 80s, an America in which anyone over the age of 20 could remember segregation, they could remember the Civil Rights Movement, remember the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. There were all these amazing new job opportunities within Atlanta, but most of the jobs were going to white people rather than black people, that inbuilt systematic racism. There was still a huge amount of racial tension across the country at this time, but particularly in the southern states. The stories I'm going to be sharing with you today centre around the young black children and their families who predominantly lived in the poorer areas of the inner city, in the metropolitan area of the city of Atlanta, as well as Fulton County, DeKalb County, Cobb County and Douglas County. Due to their living situations, a lot of these families really struggled for money, and some of these boys were known to roam the streets doing odd jobs for money, cleaning cars, selling things, running errands for random people. Some of them were petty thieves, they stole to help feed their families. Some older victims may have been sex workers. These kids were street kids, they were outside all day, every day, running errands, playing, they were just always outside, which is unusual when you think about how kids are always inside today. But they were constantly coming into contact with a huge number of different people on a daily basis, which can make it hard to track down their movements and who they've been speaking to. And also, in such close communities such as these, a lot of the victims knew each other. A lot of them were casual acquaintances, they attended the same school, neighbours, relatives, and it was just tragedy after tragedy for these small communities. It was over 40 years ago that this story began, in July 1979. Over the coming couple of years, it became commonplace for young black boys to just disappear off the streets. Their bodies eventually discovered in the woods, in the river, or just dumped wherever the killer deemed acceptable. And it all started with 14-year-old Edward Hope Smith, known as Teddy, and 13-year-old Alfred Evans. Both of them disappeared within days of each other. Edward vanished on July 21st, 1979, and Alfred on the 25th. Some claim that both boys were seen at a pot party on County Line Road, so it seems like the boys may have known each other. Edward was last seen saying goodbye to his girlfriend after spending the night at the Greenbrier skating rink, whilst Alfred was last seen by a young man named Randy, who gave him a ride to the bus stop shortly before he went missing. Both their bodies were found on July 28th by a woman who was searching through the woods for aluminium cans. She first finds the body of Edward, who had been shot in the back with a .22 caliber gun. The police attended the scene and stumbled upon a second body, that of Alfred, who was later determined to have died from probable asphyxiation by strangulation. It actually took over a year for Alfred to be identified and over a month for Edward to be identified. This was the beginning of a 2-year-long nightmare for parents and families across Atlanta. 14-year-old Milton Harvey was the next to disappear on the 4th September. Milton was small, he was 5 foot tall and 95 pounds, and you'll begin to see a pattern emerge with this throughout the video. Whoever was taking these boys had a type, they always went for the small ones. Milton was last seen riding his yellow bike approximately 3 miles from his home. He was taking a cheque to the bank. He'd had a day off school that day and then he just disappeared. A week later his bike is found just off of Sandy Creek Road and his skeletal remains weren't found until the 16th of November. Once again he was reportedly found by a man who was searching the woods for aluminium cans. Milton's cause of death remains undetermined. Then we have 9-year-old Yusuf Bell, an honour student who was in the gifted programme at his school. He went missing on Sunday the 21st of October when he went walking to the local shop to buy snuff for an elderly woman who lived in the apartment below his family. It was a warm October day and Yusuf walked to the shop barefooted. He arrived at the shop, he bought the snuff and started to head home. He gets about half a block away from the store and then he just vanishes. Yusuf's mother, Camille, calls the police, of course, who say that they'll write a report, but that's about it. Camille doesn't hear anything back from them. Imagine your 9-year-old son going missing, and it seems like the police aren't willing to do anything to help. There was a witness who claimed that they saw Yusuf get into a car with his father, John Bell, but there were questions over the reliability of this witness. Yusuf's body is found a couple of weeks later on the 8th of November in a crawl space at the empty, abandoned E.P. Johnson Elementary School building. A janitor just happened to stumble across the body whilst he was looking for a place to pee. Yusuf was found in the same brown shorts he was wearing on the day he disappeared. He'd been hit over the head twice and his cause of death was said to be asphyxiation by manual strangulation. Despite the fact that by this point multiple children had gone missing, 4 in total, the police refused to listen to Camille Bell when she started to talk of a serial killer being on the loose, a serial offender. She wasn't taken seriously. They said that she was just overreacting, and because the police refused to take it seriously, the word wasn't spread about these young boys going missing. The media didn't talk about it. People didn't know that young black boys were disappearing off the street, and therefore parents continued to let their boys wander unsupervised. Had word gotten out sooner, how many lives would have been spared? Would they have been able to find the perpetrator quickly? It's easy to speculate in hindsight, and it's also easy to just call the early police work in this case just plain incompetent. On March 4th, 1980, the first female victim disappeared, 12-year-old Angel Lanier. She left her home that afternoon around 4 p.m. and goes around a friend's house. She disappears on the journey back home and is found 6 days later in a wooded area about 3 blocks from her home. She was in the clothes she was wearing on the day she disappeared, with a pair of white panties stuffed in her mouth, and I don't think they were hers. Electrical cord bound her hands together and her cause of death was asphyxiation by ligature strangulation. 2 men were arrested for her disappearance, but it didn't go any further than that. The day after Angel's body was found, 10-year-old Jeffrey Mathis disappeared. He was 4 foot 8 tall and 71 pounds, small even for a 10-year-old boy. His mother sent him out on an errand to the nearby gas station, Star Service, to buy cigarettes. A barber reported seeing Jeffrey as he knocked on his window whilst he was out on his errands, and months later a girl reported that she actually saw Jeffrey get into a blue car with 2 men, 1 white man and 1 black man. Another witness would also report that he saw Jeffrey in a blue car almost 2 weeks after he went missing. But of course, he never returns home and his body isn't found for almost a year, 11 months to be exact. He was eventually discovered in a patch of woodland miles from his home and he was found by FBI agents with the assistance of a dog. Atlanta's mayor, Maynard Jackson, was actually the one to knock on the front door of the Mathers household and tell Willie Mae, Jeffrey's mother, that her son's remains had been found. He was identified through dental records, his body badly decayed, and as far as I'm aware, they were never able to confirm a cause of death for Jeffrey. Willie Mae joins Camille in her fight, and they start an action group called the Committee to Stop Children's Murders to ensure that awareness was being raised of what was going on and to try and put pressure on the police to take action. But these were poor black families being affected, poor black boys being murdered in the very early 1980s in the southern USA. Eric Middlebrook disappeared in May. He was last seen at home where he lived with his foster parents, answering the phone before hurrying off on his bike with some tools in hand. He was 14 years old but only 4'10" and weighed just 88 pounds. His body was found just the next day, next to his bike in a rear garage of an Atlanta bar, which just happened to be located next to what was then the Georgia Department of Offender Rehabilitation. He was found with his pockets turned inside out and his chest and arms had slight stab wounds, but his cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head, which is a variation from the usual asphyxia by manual or ligature strangulation that we've been seeing mostly up till this point. A few weeks earlier, Eric had actually testified against 3 juveniles in a robbery case, so the first thought when he was found was that his death may have been related to this, but generally he is thought to be a victim of the Atlanta child murders. Eric's case was actually considered to be a pattern case in the later trial, one of the 12 cases in which circumstantial evidence led to links between all of these different murders. On the 9th of June, 12-year-old Christopher Richardson goes missing. He was last seen outside a fast food store walking towards the DeKalb County Midway Recreation Center to go for a swim. His body wouldn't be found for over 6 months, discovered on the 9th of January in a wooded area just north of Red Wine. He was found by the dog of a nearby resident, alongside the body of Earl Terrell, who we'll look at more deeply in a second. Police are actually nearby looking for another missing boy called Luby Jeter when this resident comes up to them and reports that his dog just smelt awful, and he had a feeling that his dog had been nosing in something. The bodies of both Christopher and Earl were quickly found, each missing some clothing. There was some confusion over the identification of Christopher at first, as medical examiners said that the teeth did not match Christopher's dental record and that the swim trunks he was found wearing were not familiar to his family. But in the end, it is thought to be Christopher, but the confusion over all this raised questions over the true identity of the body, and there still is question around it. His body was too decomposed to establish a cause of death, but many items were found near the bodies, including shotgun shells, 2 magazines, a cigarette butt, and magnetic recording tape. The police did find fingerprints on these magazines, which they thought was their first real lead in this case. In the end though, the fingerprints were matched with somebody who the task force just did not consider to be a strong suspect in this case. It was a dead end. 7-year-old LaTonya Wilson was the second and last girl to go missing, but her case is a little different from the rest. She was abducted by 2 men from a 2nd floor window of her apartment, and these men just took her out of the back door, leaving it ajar. A neighbour saw the man talking to another man in the car park with LaTonya in his arms. Her body was later found in October, skeletonized, and cause of death was undetermined. Aaron Reich was 10 when he was last seen on the 23rd of June at a grocery store. He was seen getting into a blue and white Chevy with 2 black men. A witness said they saw Aaron being led from the store by a 6-foot-tall, 180-pound black man about 30 years old, leading him to this car. The description of this car actually perfectly matched the description of a car that had previously been seen trying to pick up children at a local school, the same school that Jeffrey Mathis attended. Aaron's body was found the next day under a bridge. His cause of death was positional asphyxiation, caused by a broken neck that he suffered after a fall. It's around this point in July 1980 that the police finally begin to take real action, at which point 9 children had already disappeared or been murdered. It became harder to deny that there may have been some kind of serial offender on the loose. 5 Atlanta police investigators were assigned to a special task force to investigate the missing and murdered cases. As time goes on, this task force grows, and they say that they are to conduct the investigation under the assumption that each murder on this growing list is connected. Now, it could be worth mentioning that there are 28 victims listed as potential victims of the Atlanta child murders, but not every young black child who was murdered or missing in the Atlanta area at this time made the list. They were looking for specific types of murders and specific types of children. The FBI also get involved around this time, although it was difficult as there hadn't been any federal crimes committed, and therefore the Bureau just didn't really have any jurisdiction in this case, so they were just there to kind of help out if they were needed. John D. Glover was actually the head of the Atlanta field office at the time, and he was the first African American agent to be in charge of an FBI office. 2 FBI special agents were appointed to serve as liaison between the task force and the FBI's new behavioural science unit, and one of these was later John Douglas. If you've watched Mindhunter, this might be where it all starts to link together for you. John Douglas worked on the behavioural science unit, and he is the real-life agent that Mindhunter's Holden Ford is based on. If you have watched Mindhunter, it does seem that whilst the show is obviously fictionalised, it does actually get a lot of the relationship between the FBI and the Atlanta Police Department correct. It was a pretty strange relationship, to say the least. But FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood actually came down to help with the investigation, and he was driven around the neighbourhoods where the boys were going missing. He would later say that as soon as he turned onto these streets, everyone would stop what they were doing and they would just stare at him. He comments on this to the 2 black officers he's in the car with, and the officers laugh. They say that everyone stopped what they were doing because he was a white man in a predominantly black neighbourhood. He stood out. Hazelwood reports this back to John Glover, and the 2 of them make an observation that would prove not to be a popular one within the community. They observed that the killer had to be black. It had to be someone who would go unnoticed in these communities, who wouldn't draw attention to themselves walking down the street talking to children. And of course, this didn't go down too well because the families didn't want the perpetrator to be one of their own. It made it scarier in a way if it was someone they probably knew or spoke to, someone who they would usually think they could trust if they saw them on the street. John Douglas's later profile of the killer would also state that it was likely that the killer was black because serial killers tend to kill within their own race. It's really rare that they cross the boundaries into other races. And of course, there had been so many rumours flying around, stories of who the perpetrator could be. A lot of people just assumed that the kidnappings and murders were the work of the Ku Klux Klan, a theory that really wouldn't have been too far-fetched at the time. And it's also a theory that some of the victims' parents still believe to be true today. Investigators did look into the KKK as a possible theory for about 2 months, but they kept all of this under wraps as the fear of inciting a race riot. Obviously, tensions between the races was something that was very fragile at the time, and investigators knew that if the KKK were the perpetrators, they were probably looking for a race riot. On the 6th of July, 9-year-old Anthony Carter goes missing. He was last seen outside his home playing hide and seek with a cousin before he disappeared. He was later found in a warehouse, or some sources state next to a dumpster. His cause of death was multiple stab wounds. Then on the 30th of July, there's 10-year-old Earl Terrell who disappears. He is the name I mentioned earlier in connection with Christopher Richardson. He was last seen sitting outside the South Bend Park pool after being kicked out before being seen at a grocery store near his house. He was found next to Christopher's body in a wooded area by a resident's dog. Alongside Christopher, Earl's cause of death was also undetermined. By the end of the year, there were a number of other victims, including 12-year-old Clifford Jones, who was found next to a dumpster and killed by ligature strangulation. Now, multiple people were implicated in Clifford's death though. A number of witnesses at the nearby laundromat saw a man named Calvin strangle and beat Clifford, as well as saw the manager of the same laundromat reportedly rape him. But I will talk more about Clifford's case later in the video. 11-year-old Darren Glass was last seen getting off the church bus after going to see the Atlanta Braves game. He's never been found. 10-year-old Charles Stevens was suffocated. Aaron Jackson died of asphyxiation. 16-year-old Patrick Rogers, who was the oldest victim yet, died of blunt force trauma to the head. All of this happened by the end of 1980. In the October, a curfew was actually put in place which barred children under 17 from being on the streets between 7 PM and 6 AM. It was originally to only be in effect for 90 days, but it was given the option to be renewed if needed. This curfew caused mixed reactions across the city. Some felt like it was the safest thing to do, the only way to ensure that children were home and safe during such tumultuous times. Others felt like it was a form of victim blaming. Instead of actually catching the killer, the police are just confining these children who spent all their time outside to their homes. There was also a nightly bulletin on TV across Atlanta which asked, "It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?" The council also set up a reward fund for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for the killings. It started at $20,000, then rose to $50,000, and there were all these different awards from all of these different companies across Atlanta. So the reward ended up being a pretty big amount of money. And the investigation did seem to be moving forward, albeit slowly. Investigators were beginning to link together some of the crime scenes. Several pieces of evidence became common denominators, such as these green nylon carpet fibres and dog hairs that were found on many of the bodies that had been found on dry land. It confirmed that it was likely the same person or the same group of people that were committing most of the murders, if there was any doubt about that before. But around October 1980, information about these fibres was leaked to the press, who were literally trying to do anything they could to get even a tiny piece of information about the investigation. In a matter of months, this case had gone from the mothers being ignored by the police, a complete denial of there being any problem whatsoever, to this being nationwide news. Every news outlet, every newspaper across the country was covering it. So when the Atlanta Journal-Constitution found out about these fibres, they immediately published this brand new information. And as a result, the pattern of disposal changed. Beforehand, most of the bodies were disposed of on dry land, usually in woodland or by dumpsters. But suddenly the bodies began being dumped stripped naked into the two nearby rivers, the South River and the Chattahoochee River. On November 6th, the Attorney General instructs the FBI to get involved, and they open up a preliminary investigation. By November 17th, the major case investigation was opened by the FBI, known as ATKID. The Bureau was to conduct an independent investigation while simultaneously assisting the local task force with manpower, guidance, and technical assistance. It was all hands on deck from here on out. But over the Christmas season, after ATKID begins, things actually go very quiet and no new bodies are found. In the January of 1981, John Douglas actually joins Roy Hazelwood in Atlanta, a few months after the FBI first got involved. As I previously mentioned, John Douglas was part of the FBI's new behavioural science unit. John comes, he looks at all the case files before forming a profile of the man he believed would be the killer in this case. He travelled across the USA conducting interviews with a number of other serial killers and mass murderers in a time when this had never been done previously. He created the basis of our understanding of serial killers today. His profile stated that the killer was most likely a black man of average or above average intelligence, articulate, and likely presented himself as a figure of authority. It was obvious that the killer was clearly paying close attention to the media coverage of the murders, illustrated by how he changed his method of disposal, and he was probably someone who had frequent changes in employment or was self-employed. There's also another interesting story about how they knew for certain this killer was following the press coverage. At one point, a man called up the police stating that he's the murderer. He gives directions as to where they can find the next body on Sigmund Road. Now, John Douglas immediately knows that this isn't the man they're looking for, but he also knows that they should probably arrest him because he'll cause all kinds of problems for the investigation if they don't. So the police go out and search, intentionally searching on the wrong side of the road. Obviously they don't find anything, and soon the caller actually calls back and reminds them for being so stupid. But of course this was planned, the police trace his phone and they arrest this man. But soon after this happens, a body is found on Sigmund Road. The killer is paying attention. And whilst all of this is going on with the FBI, the murders are continuing. 14-year-old Luby Jeter goes missing on the 3rd of January. He was last seen at the Stewart Lakewood shopping centre selling car deodorizers in the car park. He's seen getting into a car, and his body was found missing all of his clothes except his shorts, and his cause of death was asphyxiation by manual strangulation. Some of his clothes were found about 300 yards away, and this was another pattern case for the later trial. 15-year-old Terry Pugh goes missing on the 22nd of January, last seen trading bottles for money near a shopping centre before going for food. It's his body that is found the next day on Sigmund Road by a passerby. Dog hairs were found on Terry's body, and his cause of death was asphyxiation by ligature strangulation, another pattern case. In the next couple of months, teenagers Patrick Baltzar, Curtis Walker, Joseph Bell and Timothy Hill all fall victim. Some are discovered in the river, some in woodland. 21-year-old Eddie Duncan disappears on the 20th of March, found a couple of weeks later by canoeists in the Chattahoochee River. He was found just 24 hours after Timothy Hill was found in that exact same spot. 20-year-old Larry Rogers was only 5'1", discovered in the kitchen of an abandoned apartment. Dog hairs found on his body, and his cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation. 23-year-old Michael McIntosh was found on the banks of the Chattahoochee River in April. 21-year-old Jimmy Payne was the same. You'll notice that towards the end here, the victims are all seeming to get slightly older. They're in their early 20s now, and this may well have been a consequence of the curfew. Children weren't allowed out past 7 p.m. The body of 17-year-old William Barrett was found in May by FBI agents on a curb in a wooded area on Winthrop Drive. Cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation, and he also had a post-mortem stab wound. It really didn't seem like the murders were going to be stopping anytime soon, and the police had very few / no leads in this case, apart from the dog hairs and the nylon fibres that just seemed to be popping up on a large number of these victims. So towards the end of April, one agent proposes that they should be watching the bridges over the South and Chattahoochee rivers, 14 bridges in total. This agent or officer had grown up in a small river town and had surmised that the bodies had to be being dropped off the bridges into the middle of the river. The killer wouldn't just be placing the bodies on the riverbank and hoping they'd be washed away. This killer was smart and methodical. He would have known to drop the bodies in the centre of the river, where the current was the strongest. With no other real leads to follow, investigators decided to follow this train of thought and see where it goes. There were teams of APD recruits joined by officers and FBI agents who would be stationed both below each bridge and parked up at either end of every single bridge, all 14 of them, hidden away so nobody would be able to see them. For 4 weeks, the bridges were watched from sunset to sunrise with no suspicious activity whatsoever. It just seemed to be a waste of time, and the surveillance was about to come to an end. But on the last night, in the early morning hours of the 22nd of May 1981, the officers stationed on Chattahoochee River at James Jackson Parkway Bridge in Cobb County heard a loud splash, like something heavy, a body, had just been dropped into the water. The officers radio the FBI agents to report the splash, and they quickly note a light-coloured station wagon driving slowly across the bridge. They watch it drive across the bridge, turn around in a car park at the other end, and then head back over in the direction they came. And of course, this is highly suspicious behaviour, so the agent stops the car. The driver of the car, the only occupant, identified himself as a man called Wayne Williams. The officers asked him why he thinks he's been stopped, and he replies immediately, "It must be about those boys." They ask him what he's doing driving so late at night. It's about 2 a.m, and he says that he's a talent scout. He's doing a dry run to the house of a woman named Cheryl Johnson, who he says he's got an interview with in just a few hours' time. He gives the place an address and phone number of this Cheryl Jackson, but of course no one of that name existed at or near the address given, and the phone number didn't lead to a Cheryl Jackson. Of course, Wayne Williams denied stopping on the bridge at any point and denied dropping anything into the river, but he allowed the officers to search his car. In the car, which was on loan from his uncle, they found a bag of men's clothing, a bag of women's clothing, and a 2-metre length of white nylon cords. But seeing as there was no actual evidence of any crime being committed, he was just allowed to leave, taking the white nylon cord with him, and it was never found again. But it was 2 days later when the body of the final victim on the official list of victims of the Atlanta child killer is found in the river, not far from the bridge. It's 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater. He was reportedly last seen at the entrance of the Rialto Theatre in Atlanta, holding hands with a man who was later identified as Wayne Williams. Nathaniel's cause of death was ligature strangulation. And of course, once Nathaniel's body surfaces, Wayne Williams shoots straight to the top of the suspects list, and he's placed under 24/7 surveillance. By early June, a search warrant is executed for the station wagon and Wayne Williams' home, where he still lived with his parents. He was ordered to make an appearance at the Atlanta field office as well. Now a little about Wayne Williams. He was 23 years old at this time. He was a man born and bred in Atlanta. He was known to be somewhat of a child prodigy by those who knew him as a kid. He built and operated his own radio station by the time he was a teenager. As an adult, he was private and he kept people at a distance, and he was also quite a short man himself. He was only 5'7" tall. He was very interested in radio and music, but for a short while became really interested in the news business. At one point he acquired a police radio scanner and a flashing light for his car so he could get to crime scenes before anyone else and get the first scoop. I think his only criminal arrest was getting arrested for this, and he ended up in traffic court. Then he becomes a self-employed talent scout and record producer. He's looking to create the next Jackson 5, and he would prowl the streets looking for talent, asking young boys to come to his studio and record demos, promising them a place in his group, Gemini. Wayne Williams said he screened hundreds of children over the years, but he never found that talent he was looking for. But maybe all this seems like the perfect excuse for picking young boys up off the street. He would offer them their shot at fame and fortune, and Williams was a friendly face in the community. He was someone that people knew, albeit not particularly well, but people knew him. In their search of the Williams house, the police seized the bedspread from Wayne's bed, which contained light violet acetate fibres, consistent with those found on 18 of the victims. They found white dog hairs with black tips shed by the family dog, consistent with dog hairs found on 9 of the victims. They found green nylon carpet, which matched the fibres found on 13 of the victims. This, combined with everything else, led to the arrest of Wayne Williams on June 21st, 1981. But he was only arrested for the murder of Nathaniel Cater. On July 17th, he's indicted on a second count of murder, that of Jimmy Payne, and it remains just those two. He is never arrested for any of the other 26 murders, none of the children. The trial of Wayne Williams began on January 6th, 1982. The prosecution's case rested largely on the fibre evidence, focusing mainly on the green fibres from the shag carpet throughout the Williams home. But of course these weren't the only fibres. They'd also found matches to the ones on his bedspread, clothes and the dog hair. Although it seems like the dog hair wasn't focused on so much in this case because it was a common breed of dog, a German Shepherd. There were no fingerprints or murder weapon presented, as well as no motive really, just the fact that Wayne was potentially a homosexual and had an issue with poor families. This wasn't a trial for every single murder attributed to the Atlanta child killer. This was just a trial for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Payne, 2 adults. But in the state of Georgia, the law permits that a pattern of criminality can be demonstrated by the prosecution. They can show similarities between various criminal acts. And the court allows prosecution in this case to present evidence collected from the other murder victims that bore a similar appearance to that of Nathaniel and Jimmy. These other murder victims are the pattern cases I've mentioned multiple times throughout this video. Now the green carpet fibres in this case were analysed thoroughly, and this was the early 80s, green shag carpet was pretty popular. But the fibre experts managed to trace the fibres found on the bodies back to its original source. And this particular carpet was manufactured in Georgia for just a 1-year period from 1970 to 1971. Experts testified that the probability of randomly finding a house with this carpet was 1 in 7,792. What were the chances of Wayne Williams driving over the bridge at the same time the officers heard a big splash, and him just happening to have this same carpet? There is room for error, of course, but the link is overwhelming. And there were also multiple witness testimonies that placed Wayne Williams with multiple victims before they died. When Wayne was cross-examined by the prosecution, John Douglas actually advised them how best to interview him. John told the prosecutor to keep Wayne on the stand for as long as possible and to focus on all of his failures in life. And as predicted, Wayne loses his composure, he gets angry and he alienates the jury as a result. So the defence did have their work cut out for them, but they actually did a pretty good job in this case. They did stand up to the prosecution. One of their main thoughts was that Wayne was only 5'7". He was a fairly short man, and Nathaniel Cater was over 6 foot tall. Would Wayne really have been able to kidnap and murder Nathaniel before being able to drag his body out of the car and throw it over the side of the bridge? It would be more likely he'd be able to do that with children as they were smaller, and the killer did generally go for children, but Nathaniel was a full-grown, tall adult. On the 27th of February, after 12 hours of deliberation, a jury found Wayne Williams guilty of the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Payne. He was given 2 consecutive life sentences. Interestingly, when he was arrested, the killings did stop, and there has never been another killing attributed to the Atlanta child killer. Once Wayne was convicted for the murders of Nathaniel and Jimmy, the rest of the cases were all just closed. The majority of them have been attributed to Wayne Williams, although he has maintained his innocence since the beginning. He remains in prison today. But there has been a lot of criticism and controversy over his guilt. A lot of people, even some of the parents of victims, do not believe that he is the man responsible for the murders, and they believe that the Atlanta Police Department should have continued looking into the cases. Many argue that the city was just eager to close the case and use Wayne as a scapegoat, a convenient person to blame. A lot of people do still believe that it was the Ku Klux Klan and that the city are just trying to save their own or cover their backs. Some say that the political and societal pressure for answers in this case meant that the police just didn't get the opportunity to do their jobs to the full extent. There are certain cases that have been attributed to Williams that people really tend to focus on here when they're arguing his innocence. For example, there's the case of Clifford Jones. He was raped and strangled, and there were 5 witnesses who saw this happen. 5 witnesses who implicated a man who was not Wayne Williams in Clifford's death. You probably think this would just mean that Clifford simply wasn't a victim of the Atlanta child killer. Maybe Wayne just did the rest of them. Except the fibres used to convict Wayne were also found on Clifford's body. That alone could invalidate the entire case against Wayne, which was built completely upon this fibre evidence. And then there's other cases where boys were last seen getting into cars with white men, or getting into a car with both a white man and a black man. Could it simply be that there were more people than just Wayne Williams involved in this? Could some of the murders have been copycat murders? It's undeniable that there are a couple of cases that just don't fit with the rest. The murders of LaTonya Wilson and Angel Lanier, for example, they're widely considered now to maybe not have been the work of the Atlanta child killer of Wayne Williams. Over the years, Williams has appealed multiple times asking for retrials, and each time he's been rejected. John Douglas himself has said that he never believed that Wayne Williams committed all of the murders. He said that you can link about 10 or 11 of the cases through evidence and behaviour, but that all 28 of them are questionable. In recent years, there have been efforts to prove once and for all that the city got the right guy, that Wayne Williams was definitely the killer. In 2007, the FBI performed DNA tests on 2 human hairs found on one of the victims, and the outcome of these tests was simply that they couldn't eliminate the possibility that the hairs did belong to Williams. In 2010, they tested hairs found on the body of Patrick Balthazar, the results of which were not conclusive. The DNA sequence they found appears only in 29 out of 1,148 African American hair samples on the FBI database, so it couldn't be ruled out as Williams. They also tested the dog hairs found and found a DNA sequence that was indeed present in the Williams family's German Shepherd. But once again, this isn't conclusive, as this same DNA sequence appears in about 1 in 100 dogs. All this DNA testing, they can never 100% prove that this is definitely Williams' DNA, but they also can't rule him out in any of the cases. In March 2019, just this year, the Atlanta mayor and Atlanta police chief announced they would be retesting evidence from these murders, hoping that modern technology may shed more light on the crimes and help grieving relatives finally find closure. All 28 cases were reopened. Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms said, "We hope to let them know that we have done all that we can do to make sure their memories are not forgotten, and in the truest sense of the word, to let the world know that Black lives do matter." She speaks as someone who was 9 years old when the killings began. She remembers the fear. As for my own stance on this story, I'm inclined to believe that Wayne Williams is guilty of at least some of the murders. There's too much evidence here to point to him. I'm really not convinced that he is responsible for all of the murders. I don't believe that the cold cases of the children should have been closed as a result of the trial. He was never tried for those. I think Atlanta are doing the right thing now by reopening the cases and taking another look. And I'm intrigued to find out what new evidence comes out of them as a result of all this new technology. It'll probably be a while before we have any more answers in this case, but I can't wait for something new to come out if there is anything. And that is the story of the Atlanta child murders. There are 28 names on that list, and somebody's only been convicted of 2 of them, and even then, people question it. I feel like the Atlanta PD should have done more to try and get conclusive answers in this case. All of these cases shouldn't have just been attributed to Williams and closed. I'm sure there's more they could have done, but at least they're doing it now, and that really is a big step forward, so I really hope they do find something. Let me know in the comments if you think Wayne Williams is indeed guilty of this, or do you think he's been unfairly accused? Also, let me know if there are any other cases you want me to talk about on this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.